Hello, and welcome to the ThinkJSOU webinar series, brought to you by the Office for Strategic Engagement. Today, we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policy of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, or U.S. SOCOM. If you have questions after this session, please email thinkjsou@jsou.edu.
Well, hey, good morning, everybody from ThinkJSOU. Today we're going to talk to Dakota Cary and about cybersecurity in China. And before we get started, Dakota, I'd like, if you wouldn't mind, give us a little bit of introduction about yourself and your background, and then we'll get started.
Happy to. So my name is Dakota. I'm currently a consultant at Krebs Stamos Group. I'm a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. My research has tended to focus on Chinese hacking teams' efforts to improve their capabilities, either through education or investments in different technologies, the relationships between those hacking teams and the bureaucracies that control them, whether it's the military, the civilian intelligence services, or other institutions that they're a part of in collaborating with those intelligence and security services. In my current job, I provide similar such advice to folks in the private sector who are navigating their relationship and exposure to China, its market, and the interests of intelligence services and collecting what they have to offer.
Wow, that sounds great. Fantastic background, and thank you for that introduction. So our discussion today will focus on your research that you kind of just touched on, the areas that you look at, and how what our Secretary of Defense describes as China as our pacing challenge, how they look at cybersecurity and cyber operations. And we'll kind of explore that through the following issues. We'll look at China's view of cybersecurity responsibility, so kind of discussing the civ-mil relationship. And if you would, and I'll get into some questions in a minute, but kind of compare and contrast that to how you look at how the U.S. looks at it.
Mm-hmm.
And then China's view of growing their own cybersecurity workforce, and again, kind of contrasted with U.S. challenges. And China's thoughts about the concepts of offensive and defensive cyber operations. I think we wrestle with that, whether to call them offensive and defensive, or is it one contiguous operation? So we'll look at that. So let's just dive right in. Do you think China differentiates the cybersecurity responsibilities for, say, critical infrastructure or other such systems between civilian and military entities? And could you go into a bit of detail about kind of the history and background on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we can see from public investments in cyber ranges that are used to practice attacking and defending critical infrastructure is that there are a number of public events in which the military, People's Liberation Army, is working hand in hand with private sector cybersecurity companies and the individuals who operate and control critical infrastructure systems. What's been made public about these events does not describe who is responsible for attacking and defending these systems during an exercise. However, it's likely that the PLA is playing the offensive side, and that the cybersecurity companies and the individuals who work at critical infrastructure operations, electrical grids, water treatment supplies, you name the critical infrastructure sector. And the exercises take place in such a way that all the parties benefit. The major difference between the US and the Chinese system as it relates to critical infrastructure is that in the United States, our critical infrastructure is typically owned and operated by private companies who have a legitimate monopoly on a market to supply electricity, to do water treatment, et cetera. And in most cases, there's not a legal authority to compel an organization or a company who operates these systems to take specific actions on cybersecurity, to do exercises, or to work with the government to remediate vulnerabilities. And so we've seen recent reporting from the Department of Homeland Security, CISA, talking about how the PLA was in U.S. Oil and gas pipelines in 2013. We've not seen attribution since then, but I don't think that that's because China is suddenly uninterested in those as targets. The issue is that under the current legal framework, from my understanding, the United States cannot compel organizations to participate or to work collaboratively with the U.S. government to defend these assets. And so for folks out there in the service community, the question is, from my perspective, are you critically dependent on critical infrastructure that you yourselves are not legally authorized to take action to defend? And are you dependent upon people who themselves see cyber defense of these assets as legal compliance more than a defensive mission based on how critical they are to services? And so in China, you know, it's they don't have the same system of having critical infrastructure, particularly power distribution and critical services run by private companies. They are organized as such, but they're all under state control. They're state-owned enterprises. And so the incentives are very different. And from the outside, it seems as though those people can be compelled to take part in exercises, do defensive trainings, and prepare to defend those assets. Whereas in the United States, we can ask and hope that they participate in those activities.
Right. Has your research led you to see any kind of changes in U.S. company or private sector willingness to participate in exercises, or willingness to even work with the Department of Defense, or are they not unchanged?
So I've not done specific research on this issue, but I can tell you that in anecdotally and in conversations I've had, there has been a lot of great work done by the NSA's Collaborative Defense Center, as well as work by CISA and DHS, in order to kind of put together a culture where people want to participate in those activities because they understand the threat more than they had previously. And so I think that the US currently sits in a better position than we did a decade ago, 20 years ago. I don't think that the collaboration and understanding of the need to prioritize cybersecurity and critical infrastructure is where it should be. But I think we are making progress, but we're only making as much progress as we can insofar as we are inviting these organizations to participate rather than any type of legal mechanism for compelling.
Right. What about in China? Has your research shown any kind of lessons learned on their part from their continuing working on exercises, and are they applying lessons learned to harden their cybersecurity?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that stands out is there's a cyber range in Chengdu, which is a large city in like southern central China. And the military and the city of Chengdu has copied, or in their words, NATO's Locked Shields exercise, which is obviously focused on preparing for offense and defense during cyber conflicts, particularly on critical infrastructure. And that is the comparison in their own words. And so the lessons learned are that NATO and the US and other Western nations are prioritizing the ability to attack and defend these systems. And China is willing to mirror that in-house by bringing together their critical infrastructure operators, their military, their defense contractors, and their cybersecurity firms in order to put together the same exercises. So the biggest takeaway is that they're interested in what it is that we're doing, and they are happy to try and copy it in order to be successful in those same places.
Right. Gosh, that is a bit alarming that they seem to be learning lessons perhaps faster than we are, or certainly applying them. What do you think are some of the pros and cons to the civ-mil cooperation on cybersecurity?
Yeah, absolutely. This is an interesting spot, particularly as it relates to like military operations, because there is a good bit written in Chinese military doctrine about involving civilians in conflict were it to occur. And this includes activating what are essentially cyber militias. If you'd like to read more about this, Devin Thorne at Recorded Future has written a good bit about these organizations. But effectively, in the event of armed conflict, there are people who have adequate skill sets based on their work in the private sector, who have displayed an interest and willingness to serve the state in times of need, perhaps in the way reservists do, although less formally in China. and they would participate in securing critical infrastructure systems in the event of armed conflict. And so you can imagine a situation in which escalation is occurring. Maybe there's tit for tat exchange in the cyber domain on attacks on critical systems. China would be activating the people who have been practicing alongside of military officers as part of their own volunteer militia system, as it were. In the United States, we've taken a different approach where the Reserve Corps has actually built out, from my understanding, a very sizable cohort of cybersecurity practitioners who would perform in a similar fashion, although much more formally than perhaps would occur in China. So from a civil military cooperation standpoint, it's interesting to see that we're both trying to grasp at how do we access this pool of talent who by and large is expensive in the labor market, and by the product of educating them within a DoD setting, you make them more valuable in the labor market than often they can be compensated for in-house. And so there's a perverse incentive structure where you want these people to be very good at the thing that they do because it necessarily makes us better at defending assets and attacking assets when necessary. But when they have that skill set and their time is up, they can suddenly earn a lot more money in the market elsewhere. And so both countries struggle with this same dynamic of how much does the labor cost for the thing that we need it to do, and how does that fit into our organizational structure and the mission that we're trying to accomplish?
Right. Yeah, that's great points there. I've heard former cybercom leaders discuss that very problem, and part of it can be solved a little bit by perhaps younger military folks enjoying or being able to do what they can do in the military side of the house that they couldn't do in the civilian world.
Absolutely.
But it doesn't always work out that way. That only works for a few people.
That's true.
Yeah. So yeah, really, really good points. Definitely a tough problem. Do you think that the U.S. is looking at that problem and trying to take any lessons, even from China, or or from any other countries for that matter, or are we satisfied with the kind of status quo of how we're doing things?
I don't know if anyone has come to a good policy conclusion on this. I'm not aware of a country who's really nailed how to bridge the gap between what the private sector can offer in terms of compensation and the skills that are necessary to do what's required of armed service personnel in defending those assets in the cyber domain. I don't know of anyone who's bridged that gap. Maybe somebody else is aware of that, but I'm certainly not.
Okay, yeah, but I'm definitely not, and it is definitely a hard problem that we continue to deal with.
Yeah.
Let's look at, you kind of dovetail into the workforce. So we talked about incentives, and you just talked about pay scale. So that kind of leads into discussing just how do we grow our cybersecurity workforce in general and get these skill sets multiplied across the country. How does China approach this? How do they grow their cybersecurity workforce?
Yeah, so this is actually one of the things that I think is most interesting. I've had a number of folks who are in cybersecurity policy in the United States ask about the same question. And what is inspiring to me is that China looks to us to understand what to do in order to improve their own cybersecurity talent pipeline. And so early writings in the 2000 teens and basically after 2010 or so, a lot of Chinese policymakers looked at the United States as the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education, which is put together by NIST after a 2008 order from the Bush administration, pushed forward under the Obama administration after that, which basically standardized cybersecurity curriculum. And it said that these are core competencies that you should have if you're offering an education in cybersecurity. China really liked that idea. And in 2015, they revised their own cybersecurity curriculum for degree granting universities and said, if you're going to offer a cybersecurity degree at your institution, then you have to teach the following core competencies. And that's exactly something that they lifted from the US initiative on cybersecurity education. Similarly, the US has a program called Centers for Academic Excellence in cybersecurity. The program is administered by 7 US agencies, including NSA and DHS. And they basically certify the curriculums that are taught at universities for excellence in cybersecurity defense, cyber operations, or cybersecurity research. And so these institutions in the United States, some of them are 2-year community colleges, some of them are 4-year degree programs, others are PhD research programs. They receive these certifications as a way of indicating to the marketplace that the skills being taught there are adequate and up to par with what the federal agencies would expect from somebody coming in to do that work in-house. Again, China liked that system, and in 2017 they decided to do their own version, which is called World-Class Cybersecurity Schools, and basically the exact same structure where the government and a bureau of the Civilian Intelligence Service authorizes and basically hands out these awards to universities for their cybersecurity curriculum. This is most similar to the cyber operations certification under the US program, where about 20 such schools are certified. In China, they have 11 that are certified under this world-class cybersecurity school program. And so the talent pipeline is actually very mirrored by China based on what the US has done thus far. I think the only thing that China's done that we haven't done in the United States, and that I personally don't think we should consider doing, is that they've invested in a national cybersecurity talent and innovation base. So this is a campus in Wuhan, China. They have a national cybersecurity school, which is 2 universities, both who have world-class cybersecurity school certification. And they are combining their 3rd and 4th year college students at this campus and saying this is, a national academy for cybersecurity, essentially. They have cyber ranges in the classroom. Everyone gets hands-on experience on offense and defense. There is an offense and defense research laboratory, which does not talk about what it does, but I think it's in the name. And we know that the Civilian Intelligence Service also has a building on the campus. And then there's room for private industry to come on board in phase 2 of this campus, as it were, to build their own offices, to hire talent, to provide internships. And what they tried to do is basically cultivate an ecosystem, Silicon Valley style, specifically focused on cybersecurity, where they have the investors, the professionals, the students, the PhDs doing research, and they're trying to create this very concentrated area of folks focused on cybersecurity. I think in the United States, we achieve this more organically than a top-down approach. I think it is essentially just a difference in public policy.
Right. Maybe a bit market-driven.
Exactly, that's right. And I think for that, we are thankful and frankly more effective because our ability to educate people is spread across the United States, whereas in China it's very concentrated in places with high income or in places that are designated like the National Cybersecurity Talent and Innovation Base, whereas in the United States there are literally hundreds of 2-year degree programs that you can go to that receive NSA certification for a Center of Excellence in Cyber Defense. And I think that is a good way to do it. It feels sometimes as though we may be doing less, or it feels as though we may not be as organized. But the reality is that our current system has produced the innovative policies that China is copying. And so we should really lean into the disorganization and the ability for people to innovate.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think just that having it spread across the United States does just that, adds gives you a diverse base to develop and innovate throughout the countries. I think, maybe where we're falling short is just producing enough. We always hear just anecdotally that we're short of cybersecurity professionals, whether it's in the military or the civilian world. Is that
China says the exact same thing. They've got a shortfall. I think the most recent number that I've seen is 300,000 is their best estimate. In 2019, I think that their number was closer to 700,000 to 1.4 million. I think that they haven't educated that many people in that time span. They've just gotten better data. They understand the market better. Automation of cybersecurity is improving. And so the need has fallen for them, at least based on their, the most recent analysis that they themselves have published. But they're estimated to graduate about 20 to 30,000 cybersecurity degrees per year. I don't know how that compares to the United States. Unfortunately, that's not my focus, but the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown has published recent research on the US cybersecurity system, and they would have more accurate numbers.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, I don't know those numbers either, but it seems like we're continually behind on producing the professionals that we need to be producing to keep up with innovation. Speaking of innovation, what do you think about cyber ranges? And if you could just explain a little bit about, like, for those of the audience that don't know, what is a cyber range and what is it used for?
Yeah, absolutely. So cyber ranges are a bit like test flight simulators for pilots, I imagine. I don't know. I've never been in one. I don't fly planes. But it's effectively the same thing where they say, okay, we put together a number of computers, and within the system, you can practice your attack and defense on targets. You can practice stealing files, deleting systems, etc. And the goal is to provide a safe practice environment where the tools that are being used cannot get outside the facility on accident. And the goal is to get folks who are using it acquainted with the offensive and defensive tools that they would be using in their job or whatever vocation it is. So these exist at college universities. There are a number in the United States. There are a number in China. They're all over because they are so critical to practicing. What's most interesting is when governments invest in these things. The United States itself has 4 that are designated for the Department of Defense. They actually started, I believe, in 2008 under a DARPA program. Again, another thing that China liked and that they copied themselves in 2010, invested in one, and now have a number of them across China. And the main purpose is for people to practice attacking and defending specific targets. A number of the ones in China have industrial control systems or are associated with the military or civilian intelligence services, where if you were interested in attacking an industrial control system, you need to understand, you did a very high level of understanding of what physical systems are on the network, how they're connected, the relationships, and then the things you would need to do in order to have an impact on that system if you were to attack it. And so they're most useful in helping people understand the impact that a particular action would have on a targeted network.
Right. Okay. Thank you. We've spent some time talking about like civ-mil relations, and you mentioned that DoD had 4 of these ranges. But
Sure.
Do you see any value in having some sort of hybrid version somewhere where the military and civilians, at least in the U.S., are working together, since this infrastructure is so heavily owned by the private industry?
Right. I think that's for me, I think it depends on what policymakers want in the event of a crisis or in the event of armed conflict. If there is a situation in which the folks sit down at the table and decide that they want or may come to need help defending critical infrastructure networks, then they should work with those providers to basically get folks in a collaborative place where, like, you need a certain level of familiarity to defend something well. And so it's very difficult, and we don't want to get to a place where a crisis is occurring and help is willing to arrive and show up, but it's very difficult. There's a high learning curve to being effective. Right. Now, we've seen teams like this drop in and be effective, at least from recent reporting, in the Ukraine conflict. Prior to military action by Russia, multiple news outlets have reported that the U.S. sent folks over to basically kick Russia out of Ukrainian systems. It's unclear to me whether or not those folks were already familiar with those systems, or if they went over and looked for files and indicators of compromise that they knew were associated with Russia. That much is unclear. It is possible, though, to show up and try and help defend these systems. So I think it's up for policymakers to decide, in the event of a crisis or armed conflict, what is the degree to which we're willing to be reliant on the private sector to provide these services itself? And do we believe that they can? And if we don't believe that they can, what can we do in the meantime to improve their ability to respond?
Right, yeah, all good points. I think it goes to one of our SOF, our Special Operations Forces truths, that you can't manufacture such skill sets in a crisis. Right?
That is absolutely true.
What, as far as cyber ranges that we talked about, do you think that that we have enough of them? So we just talked about whether the military should work with the civilians on them, but should, even in our civilian workforce, is there a need for more of them? Are they expensive to build and maintain, or do you think we got about the right amount now?
That's a question for me that pivots on the operational needs of the U.S. military and the intelligence community. And the reason for that is, if you're in the private sector and you think that there's value in one of these, your job is to convince your manager, your CFO, somebody to shell out some money for to rent one or to access one. There are a number of companies in the United States who provide these. From the private sector, there are private sector firms who specifically offer these to the U.S. military to practice defending satellite assets, et cetera. These kind of niche cases that maybe wouldn't earn an entire line of funding, but do need support at some point in time. And so there's a robust market for providing these as needed. The real question, I think, is, are the operators who are being asked to have the capability to impact specific systems, do they have the tools and resources they need to be successful? And if the folks who are being asked to have those capabilities feel as though they don't need an additional cyber range, what they do, I just hope that the people who are managing them listen to what they're asking for.
Right. That would be a novel approach, right? Having budget decision makers listen to the user. We hope we can get that to
We certainly
work.
do. Absolutely.
We talked a little bit about offensive and defensive operations. How does China see that? Do they see two distinct operations, offensive and defensive, or do they see it along a continuum? How does China view that?
Yeah, so I think that this is an interesting point, because according to the Chinese government, they don't do the hacking. They're not responsible for it. They would never do it. It's irresponsible. They push policy documents out to the public that say that China would never engage in such activities, and we want to establish a norm where nobody's hacking anybody, which is just blatantly false. But they are willing to talk about it. And so when we get into Chinese military doctrine, there is an acknowledgement and acceptance and a focus on using these, like the cyber domain, as a way of achieving asymmetric leverage, essentially. And so, like one part of doctrine that stands out to me is a focus on satellites in the event of armed conflict. The U.S. military is very effective when a carrier group gets together off your coast. It is very difficult to do anything to stop them from achieving their objectives. And one of the best things that you can do if you are an enemy of the United States is to try and prevent the collaboration from occurring. And you do that by attacking command and control vis-a-vis satellites. And so we're in this interesting space from a sector development standpoint, where the satellite sector used to be strictly DoD, NASA, US government, just governments, period. And we're privatizing the space over the last 4 decades and much more rapidly as of late. And so there are a lot of new private sector players in the satellite space who may provide the Department of Defense with critical services. And so we're getting into this interesting place of, from a doctrinal standpoint, if China anticipates armed conflict, one of the first things that they will do is try to knock out command and control through cyber attacks on satellites. If those don't work, electronic attacks on satellites. And so there's a real interest and priority here. However, we go back to this place where, does the DoD or do Western nations own the assets that they are critically dependent on, and can they defend them? Do they have the legal authorities to be defending those things, even if they're dependent upon them? And so from a doctrinal standpoint, there's not a lot of differentiation between offense and defense, mostly because the conversation around this is so muted by the party line of we're not acting this way. However, if you look at the structure of the PLA, they have their strategic support force, which focuses on both satellite space-based operations and computer network-based operations. So they have units, they've got infrastructure, bureaucracy, and policies to support these capabilities. But when it comes to talking about it, it's never that China will be using it first. However, if you read closer into like what operationally may occur, then you start to see how they would actually use those capabilities that they say that they're not interested in.
What kind of, that seems like it's multiplying our vulnerabilities to rely on public sector or private industry to be in charge of our command and control.
It's a hard line to balance. I think that from my understanding, the Department of Defense has their own systems that they operate, control, and are responsible for. I think that the private sector may provide add-ons to that system, as it were, like backups to backups, essentially. But I'm not an expert in the space marketplace.
Well, neither am I. So we won't get into a discussion about that. What about assessments, right? So how does China assess its actions in cyberspace? Does it publish any of that to say how it's doing, or have you run into that in your research?
The only assessments that I found have been from like a joint research paper between the Ministry of Education, part of the Civilian Intelligence Service, and some other bureaucracies within the Chinese government, and they all focus on talent.
Okay.
And they focus on the capabilities of the people who are graduating, the time spent at work of the people who work in these jobs, the number of them who complain about having to do administrative tasks versus actually doing cyber network defense is almost comical. They talk about the demographics of the people in these groups. And so like from a capability standpoint, there's a much more of a focus on the talent side of the house and who they have, what they can do, where they're coming from, how long they're staying, what they're paid, and then what they're asked to do during their time, in the workplace, wherever they might be.
Okay.
And so from an assessment standpoint, they, from my perspective, rightfully focus on the talent, because so much of cybersecurity and the cyber domain itself is the people you have sitting behind a computer. It's almost never about some special tool or like a weapons platform that makes it a difference as it does in the physical domain.
Okay. Yeah, good points. All right. Well, thank you very much. Well, I don't think I have any other questions for you. I really appreciate your time, and I hope that you've educated our audience on some of these really important concepts of what China is doing and how they look at cybersecurity and how they protect their critical infrastructure and the lessons they learned from the U.S. And I think we've discussed also some policy recommendations. So appreciate your thoughts on that. I'll give you the final word if you have any other thoughts to talk about.
I just wanted to say thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks to the Atlantic Council for hosting us. This has been fantastic. If you have questions, I'm on Twitter. You can also reach me via email if that's your preference. It's available on the Atlantic Council. You can reach out to me there.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Dakota. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, Nancy.